Hello, everyone. My name is Travis Campbell, and I am the founder and president of Consider This, an organization dedicated to the defense of classical Christianity. And we are in our Let's Get Scriptural series, part 5, exploring the origins of Christianity. We're looking at the life of Christ, and we're asking the question, did Jesus exist? This is part 5 of our refutation of Christ-Mythicism, the viewpoint that says that there was no historical Jesus. The refutation of Christ-Mythicism can be given in 2 stages. First of all, there are multiple reliable non-Christian witnesses to Jesus' existence. In particular, there are Greco-Roman witnesses, Thales, Pliny the Younger, Suetonius, Tacitus, Marbar Serapion, and Lucian of Samosata. We've already looked at Thales, Pliny, Suetonius, and Tacitus. Thales bore witness to the darkness that occurred during Christ's crucifixion. Pliny bore witness to multiple important Christian beliefs, at least as Christians held them at the end of the 1st and early 2nd centuries. Christians were willing to die for their faith. They refused to curse Christ, an important point when we're assessing, or to note while we're assessing, the witness of Suetonius and Tacitus. And Christians worshiped Christ as God and met weekly in Christ's honor, and even had a meal in Christ's honor, which is probably a reference to the Eucharist. Suetonius bore witness to the violence that broke out in Rome between Jews and Christians over the identity of Christus, whom most scholars believe is a reference to Christ. Suetonius also bears witness to the fact that Nero persecuted Christians. Tacitus, well, his witness really is the nail in the coffin for the Christ-Mythicists. He tells us that Christ, whom he calls Christus, died the extreme penalty, a veiled reference to crucifixion, during the reign of Tiberius while Pilate was procurator of Judea. The veiled reference to crucifixion is one of many reasons to think that this is an authentic reference to Jesus from the pen of Tacitus. And we give multiple reasons to think that Tacitus can be trusted, insofar as there are multiple reasons to think that Tacitus checked the records to make sure that the information he had about Jesus was accurate. In this video, we're going to be looking at the witnesses of Marbar Serapion, Lucian of Samosata, and for good measure, we will round out our study of the Greco-Roman witnesses by looking at Celsus. So on with our study. Who is Marbar Serapion? Marbar Serapion was a Stoic philosopher from the Roman province of Syria. He is noted for a letter he wrote in Aramaic to his son, who is named Serapion. Most scholars date this letter to shortly after the year 73. However, Van Voorst argues quite strongly against this majority view, noting that in all probability, Mar wrote the letter sometime after the year 150. This is how the letter reads, at least in part. What are we to say when the wise are dragged by force by the hands of tyrants, and their wisdom is deprived of its freedom by slander, and they are plundered for their superior intelligence without the opportunity of making a defense? They are not wholly to be pitied. For what benefit did the Athenians obtain by putting Socrates to death, seeing that they received as retribution for it famine and pestilence? Or the people of Samos, by the burning of Pythagoras, seeing that in 1 hour the whole of their country was covered with sand? Or the Jews, by the murder of their wise king, seeing that from that very time their kingdom was driven away from them? For with justice did God grant a recompense to the wisdom of all 3 of them. For the Athenians died by famine, and the people of Samos were covered by the sea without remedy. And the Jews, brought to desolation and expelled from their kingdom, were driven away into every land. Nay, Socrates did not die because of Plato, nor yet Pythagoras because of the statue of Hera, nor yet the wise king because of the new laws which he enacted. You'll notice here that the reference to the kingdom being driven away from them, and they are driven into every land, those references to the Jews being driven into every land is probably a reference not to the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70, but to the diaspora that occurred after the Bar Kokhba revolution of the 130s. So sometime after the year 135, or immediately after rather, the Romans salted the land and renamed the land Palestine, which means land of the Philistines, the ancient enemies of the Jews. And they basically barred the Jews from coming into Palestine. And so the Jews will be a diaspora all the way through the rest of the classical period and through the Middle Ages, all the way to 1948. The reference to the wise king is almost certainly Jesus. This is the last person of any note that the Jews killed because of his claims to be a king. And this king also gives new laws, and Christ was known for the deliverance of new laws. So most people do think that the wise king being referred to here is Jesus himself. So how should we evaluate Mara's letter? Well, on the one hand, Van Voorst tells us this. He says, "We know of no one else besides Jesus who lived in ancient times who comes close to this description." On the other hand, Van Voorst tells us that Mara's letter is not an independent witness to Jesus, and this for two reasons. First, it obviously links the life of the wise king with his movement and teachings, making it possible that Mara learned about the wise king from Christians. Now, I will say in passing that it's interesting, and Van Voorst makes mention of this. Jesus is never mentioned, which is peculiar if his source is from a Christian. And Mara tells us that Jesus lives on in his teachings. A Christian, by the middle of the 2nd century especially, is probably not going to say that. A Christian will say that Jesus lives on because he's been raised from the dead. But in any case, the assertion that the Jews killed Jesus is dubious. By his own logic, for Mara to implicate the Romans would go against his main point, that people who persecute and kill their wise men do so at their peril. So to summarize, Mara's letter says more about Christianity than about Christ. Most interesting is that the Stoic writer sees Christianity in a positive light and compares its founder to Socrates and Pythagoras. Van Voorst goes on to say that the earliest non-Christian philosophical reference to Christianity that we have, the letter of Mara, shows the appeal that Christianity could have for some educated people. Mara's positive allusion to Christ and Christianity should not be read as an endorsement, any more than his mention of Socrates and Pythagoras is an endorsement of their respective philosophic schools. But he uses the example of Jesus and his teachings to urge his compatriots to persevere and the Romans to relent. What Van Voorst is alluding to is the fact that Mara's people have recently suffered in a civil war with Rome, comparable to the civil war between the Jews and Rome decades earlier and even at the end of the 1st century. Who is Lucian? His Greek name is Lucianos. Latin is Lucianus. He's an ancient Greek rhetorician, pamphleteer, and satirist who died soon after the year 180. Lucian was evidently successful as a rhetorician, but he seems to have never reached the first rank in his profession. It may have been disillusion with the emptiness of his career that led him to give up his wandering life and settle in Athens in the late 50s of the 2nd century. In Athens, he was able to extend his knowledge of Greek literature and thought far beyond anything required of a rhetorician. In this early Athenian period, Lucian gave up public speaking and took to writing critical and satirical essays on the intellectual life of his time, either in the form of Platonic dialogues or, in imitation of Menippus, in a mixture of prose and verse. Lucian's writings apparently sustained the reputation he had won as a public speaker. Thanks to the patronage of his Roman friends, he obtained a lucrative post in Alexandria as archistator, a kind of chief court usher. After some years, he returned to Athens and took up public speaking again. The date and circumstances of his death are unknown. Around the year 170, Lucian writes a satire on the life of one Peregrinus Proteus of Parion, a well-known figure who converted to Christianity after committing patricide and then left it for cynicism and eventually killed himself on a pyre near the Olympic Games in the year 165. The satire consists, among other things, mockery of the Christian religion and even the Christians who helped Peregrinus while Peregrinus was in prison. This is what Lucian says, and this is a satire, so he's writing with a lot of, shall we say, sarcasm. All this and the like of it I propose to pass over, for he was still unshapen clay, and our holy image had not yet been consummated for us. What he did to his father, however, is very well worth hearing, but you all know it. You have heard how he strangled the aged man, unable to tolerate his living beyond 60 years. Then, when the affair had been noised abroad, he condemned himself to exile and roamed about, going to one country after another. It was then that he learned the wondrous lore of the Christians by associating with their priests and scribes in Palestine. And how else could it be? In an instant he made all of them, look like children, for he was prophet, cult leader, head of the synagogue, and everything, all by himself. He interpreted and explained some of their books and even composed many, and they revered him as a god, made use of him as a lawgiver, and set him down as a protector. Next after that other, to be sure, whom they still worship, the man who was crucified in Palestine because he introduced this new cult into the world. Then at length Proteus was apprehended for this and thrown into prison, which itself gave him no little reputation as an asset for his future career and the charlatanism and notoriety seeking that he was enamored of. Well, when he had been imprisoned, the Christians, regarding the incident as a calamity, left nothing undone in the effort to rescue him. Then, as this was impossible, every other form of attention was shown to him, not in any casual way, but with assiduity, and from the very break of day, aged widows and orphan children could be seen waiting near the prison, while their officials even slept inside with him after bribing the guards. Then elaborate meals were brought in, and sacred books of theirs were read aloud, and excellent Peregrinus, for he still went by that name, was called by them the new Socrates. Indeed, people came even from the cities in Asia, sent by the Christians at their common expense to succor and defend and encourage the hero. They show incredible speed whenever any such public action is taken, for in no time they lavish their all. So it was then in the case of Peregrinus. Much money came to him from them by reason of his imprisonment, and he procured not a little revenue from it. The poor wretches have convinced themselves, first and foremost, that they are going to be immortal and live for all time, in consequence of which they despise death and even willingly give themselves into custody. Most of them. Furthermore, their first lawgiver persuaded them that they are all brothers of one another. They are all brothers of one another after they have transgressed once, for all by denying the Greek gods and by worshiping that crucified Celsus himself and living under his laws. Therefore, they despise all things indiscriminately and consider them common property, receiving such doctrines traditionally without any definite evidence. So if any charlatan and trickster, able to profit by occasions, comes among them, he quickly acquires sudden wealth by imposing upon simple folk. Peregrinus kind of sounds like a lot of TV evangelists today. So how should we evaluate Lucian's witness? J.P. Holding says this: Lucian clearly held historical accuracy in high esteem. Considering that Lucian noted Christians for their simplicity and gullibility, valued historical accuracy, and was well educated, well traveled, and a major figure in a literary movement of his time, there is good reason to believe that he would not have acknowledged the existence of Jesus if there were any doubt in his mind that Jesus actually existed. This is an interesting point on the part of Holding, because you'll notice that his whole tirade is dripping with sarcasm. He clearly just thinks that Christianity is a stupid joke, and he thinks that Christians are really stupid. And as Holding goes on to say, He would certainly have satirized Christian belief in a fictional or historically doubtful personage mercilessly if any such arguments existed at the time. He was certainly in a good position to have known of such issues, being that he moved in the most educated circles and very likely corresponded and consulted with leading figures of his day. In short, Lucian was a person who was in a position to know whether or not Jesus had genuine historical roots, and was exactly the sort who would raise any relevant doubts in order to enhance the impact of his satire. Holding goes on to say, in response, critics may claim that Lucian's reference is too far past the time of Jesus to be of any value. However, the lateness of this reference is more than made up for by Lucian's critical capabilities and cannot be used to devalue this passage. There is one charge of unreliability that has been leveled against Lucian that should be considered. Van Voorst implies that Lucian is in error in saying that Christians have priests. Though he says that the term was used among Christians, words like presbyter were much more common. But this need not amount to an inaccuracy by Lucian, since Christians clearly did use the term, as Van Voorst admits. Moreover, Lucian is writing to a pagan audience who would know the term priest far better. Van Voorst also questions Lucian's use of the term scribes. Because of a negative association in the Gospels, he thinks Lucian has ascribed the title anachronistically from Judaism, but this need not be seen as a title, but rather as the name of a profession. So who is Celsus? Well, Celsus is a Greek philosopher, and he is the most important pagan intellectual opponent of Christianity before Porphyry. He flourishes during the second half of the 2nd century, and besides being the author of True Discourse, Aletheis Logos, no details on his life nor the place of his activities are extant. The original text of the True Discourse is lost, but about 9/10 of the treatise can be reconstructed with practical certainty from the extracts and arguments found in Origen's elaborate refutation against Celsus, Catechesu, in 8 books, which were composed nearly 70 years after True Discourse was written. Celsus was an adherent of Middle Platonism, but was above all a champion of Hellenic culture in all of its aspects. In his polemic, he showed a marked familiarity with the Old and the New Testaments and Christian teachings in general. However, he was not always aware of the precise differences between Judaism and Christianity, nor those between Christian orthodoxy, heresy, and Gnosticism. While showing some appreciation for the Christian concept of the Logos and for Christian ethics, he rejected the Christian concept of God as the absolute creator and branded the teachings on the incarnation and the crucifixion as absurd. He ridiculed likewise many of the biblical narratives and miracles. On the political side, he accused the Christians of being unpatriotic because of their attitude towards the religious policy of the state. Celsus was not so much a philosopher as an ardent champion of Hellenism as expressed in a long and venerable tradition. On the twin pillars of Logos and Nomos, to which antiquity had given authority, he erected a philosophy of history. Christianity was rejected as being new and outside the Hellenic tradition, indeed even a repudiation of it. This argument against Christianity was resumed by Porphyry and Emperor Julian. So here's what Celsus says about Jesus and the early Christians. It is by the names of certain demons and by the use of incantations that the Christians appear to be possessed of miraculous power. It was by means of sorcery that Christ was able to accomplish the wonders which he performed, and that foreseeing that others would attain the same knowledge and do the same things, making a boast of doing them by the help of the power of God, he excludes such from his kingdom. If they, the sorcerers, are justly excluded, while he himself is guilty of the same practices, he is a wicked man. But if he is not guilty of wickedness in doing such things, neither are they who do the same as he. A few years ago, he, Christ, began to teach this doctrine, being regarded by Christians as the Son of God. And then Origen says this about Celsus, and he's summarizing what Celsus believes. And you'll notice that Celsus was apparently in dialogue with several Jews, and so Celsus introduces a Jewish character into his polemic against Christianity. For Celsus represents the Jew disputing with Jesus and confuting him, as he thinks, on many points. So in other words, Celsus Jew, that is this Jewish character in his work, is basically questioning Jesus and refuting everything Jesus teaches and everything Jesus believes, and therefore all of what Christians believe about Jesus. And in the first place, the Jew accuses him of having invented his birth from a virgin and upbraids him with being born in a certain Jewish village of a poor woman of the country who gained her subsistence by spinning, and who was turned out of doors by her husband, a carpenter by trade, because she was convicted of adultery. That after being driven away by her husband and wandering about for a time, she disgracefully gave birth to Jesus, an illegitimate child, who, having hired himself out as a servant in Egypt on account of his poverty, and having there acquired some miraculous powers on which the Egyptians greatly pride themselves, returned to his own country, highly elated on account of them, and by means of these proclaimed himself a god. But let us now return to where the Jew is introduced, speaking of the mother of Jesus, and saying that when she was pregnant, she was turned out of doors by the carpenter to whom she had been betrothed, as having been guilty of adultery, and that she bore a child to a certain soldier named Pantera. If the mother of Jesus was beautiful, then the God whose nature is not to love a corruptible body had intercourse with her because she was beautiful. It was improbable that the God would entertain a passion for her, because she was neither rich nor of royal rank, seeing no one, even of her neighbors, knew her. When hated by her husband and turned out of doors, she was not saved by divine power, nor was her story believed. Such things, he says, have no connection with the kingdom of heaven. Celsus, Jewish critic, goes on, "But if then this was done in order that you might not reign in his stead when you had grown to man's estate, why, after you did reach that estate, do you not become a king, instead of you, the Son of God, wandering about in so mean a condition, hiding yourself through fear, and leading a miserable life up and down?" Jesus, having gathered around him 10 or 11 persons of notorious character, the very wickedest of tax gatherers and sailors, or fishermen and tax gatherers, who had not acquired even the merest elements of learning, fled in company with them from place to place, and obtained his living in a shameful and importunate manner. What need, moreover, was there that you, while still an infant, should be conveyed into Egypt? Was it to escape being murdered? But then it was not likely that a god should be afraid of death. And yet an angel came down from heaven, commanding you and your friends to flee, lest ye should be captured and put to death. And was not the great God, who had already sent 2 angels on your account, able to keep you, his only son, there in safety? The Jewish critic goes on, "The old mythological fables which attributed a divine origin to Perseus and Amphion and Acus and Minos were not believed by us. Nevertheless, that they might not appear unworthy of credit, they at least represented the deeds of these personages as great and wonderful, and truly beyond the power of man. But what hast thou done that is noble or wonderful, either in deed or in word? Thou hast made no manifestation to us, although they challenged you in the temple to exhibit some unmistakable sign that you were the Son of God." Well, let us believe that these cures, or the resurrection, or the feeding of a multitude with a few loaves, from which many fragments remained over, or those other stories of a marvelous nature, were actually wrought by you. These are nothing more than the tricks of jugglers, who profess to do more wonderful things, and to the feats performed by those who have been taught by Egyptians, who in the middle of the marketplace, in return for a few obols, that's coins, will impart the knowledge of their most venerated arts, and will expel demons from men, and dispel diseases, and invoke the souls of heroes, and exhibit expensive banquets, and tables, and dishes, and dainties having no real existence, and who will put in motion, as if alive, what are not really living animals, but which have only the appearance of life. Since then these persons can perform such feats, shall we of necessity conclude that they are sons of God? or must we admit that they are the proceedings of wicked men under the influence of an evil spirit? So how should we evaluate the witness of Celsus? The value of Celsus' comments, says Van Voorst, about the historical Jesus is limited. Because we do not have the exact wording of true doctrine and cannot be sure that Origen had given us the order of Celsus' book, conclusions must be tentative. Nevertheless, Celsus' main attack on Christianity is philosophical, not historical. His more detailed information about Jesus, which by virtue of his knowledge of Christian writings should be fairly accurate, is distorted by his sharp polemic, a part of which is lampooning. Nevertheless, it is evident that Celsus is a rich source for pagan and Jewish polemic against Christianity, and to a lesser degree its Christ. Indeed, among pagan authors, Celsus is unique in relaying both Jewish and Greco-Roman objections to Christianity. His witness to Jewish tradition is especially valuable. Polemical and tendentious, his treatment of Christ is of little value in our knowledge of the historical Jesus. Now, I'm not in full agreement with Van Voorst here. My views are a little bit more partial to those of Philip Schaff. Philip Schaff is one of the most famous historians of the modern Christian era. He died in 1893, and in his first volume, this is what he writes about Celsus. And yet, even this able infidel assailant, who lived almost within hailing distance of the apostolic age, bears witness, as St. Chrysostom already remarked, to the antiquity of the apostolic writings and the main facts of the gospel history. He thus furnishes a strong argument against the modern mythical and legendary biographies of Jesus. Celsus refers to the Gospels of Matthew, Luke, and John, and makes upon the whole about 80 allusions to or quotations from the New Testament. He takes notice of Christ's birth from a virgin in a small village of Judea, the adoration of the wise men from the east, the slaughter of the infants by the order of Herod, the flight to Egypt, where he supposes Christ learned the charms of magicians, his residence in Nazareth, his baptism, and the descent of the Holy Spirit in the shape of a dove, and the voice from heaven, the election of his disciples, his friendship with publicans and other low people, his cures of the lame and the blind, and raising of the dead, the betrayal of Judas, the denial of Peter, the principal circumstances in the history of the passion and crucifixion, also the resurrection of Christ. It is true, he perverts or abuses most of these facts, but according to his own showing, they were then generally or had always been believed by the Christians. He does not deny the miracles of Jesus, but like the Jews, he derives them from evil spirits and makes Jesus a magician and an impostor. He alludes also to some of the principal doctrines of the Christians, to the private assemblies for worship, and to the office of presbyters. He omits the grosser charges of immorality, which he probably considered absurd and incredible. So I think Schaff is a little bit closer in the assessment here. Celsus hated Christianity, and yet he was still willing to grant, at least for the sake of discussion, some of the salient facts about Jesus. And this assessment of Christianity is especially interesting because if he had any reason to think that the Christians were lying about there being a Jesus or Jesus doing some of these things, he would have no doubt exploited it in his own writings. In conclusion, we ask the question, did Jesus of Nazareth actually exist? In addition to Thales, Pliny, Suetonius, and Tacitus, there are three more pagan witnesses to the existence of Jesus, one sympathetic, that is Mara, one dismissive of the Christian faith, that is Lucian, and one that is hostile, that is Celsus. But these 7 witnesses do not exhaust the non-Christian evidence for the existence of Jesus, namely the Jewish evidence, and that's what we're going to look at next week. I want to thank all of you for spending this time with me. This is a significantly shorter video than the last one. I did that on purpose. I know that an hour and a half was much. And for those of you that have been blessed by this series and looking at these non-Christian witnesses to Jesus, I would just like to ask you to hit the subscribe button on for our YouTube channel, as well as like the video. It does us a lot of good. And if you are enjoying this, please join us next week as we begin to look at the Jewish witnesses to the historicity of Jesus. Thank you.